Hello everyone, this is History PhD channel, where we explore fascinating historical mysteries together. Today, I invite you to embark on a thrilling journey where the dream of getting rich changed the destinies of hundreds of thousands of people and reshaped the face of America forever. Imagine this. One January morning in 1848, in a small sawmill by the American River in California, a carpenter named James Marshall bent down and picked up glittering pieces of metal from the water. He had no idea that this simple discovery would spark one of the greatest migrations in human history, the California Gold Rush. Within a few years, more than 300,000 people from all over the world, from impoverished farmers to adventurous aristocrats, from desperate seekers to greedy speculators, flocked to this desolate land with a single hope: to find gold and become rich overnight. But behind the glistening gold bars lies a story of blood, sweat, and tears. Who truly made their fortune from gold? Why couldn't the first gold miners keep their secret? What tragic fate befell the native Californians? And what happened to John Sutter, the landowner where the gold was discovered, when the gold rush turned his fortune to ashes? From the legendary jeans merchant Levi Strauss to the African-American businesswoman Mary Ellen Pleasant to the criminal gangs that controlled San Francisco, each character in this story carries a fate full of unexpected twists. If you love history and are passionate about true stories that are more thrilling than novels, then this is the series for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the History PhD channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes in this fascinating journey of discovery. Now, let's travel back in time to 1848, when the American dream was still measured in the weight of gold in the palm of your hand. January 24th, 1848. A day that would forever change the destiny of America began like any other day at John Sutter's sawmill on the banks of the American River in the Coloma Valley, California. But fate had ordained that this very morning would open a chapter unprecedented in human history. James Wilson Marshall, a 37-year-old carpenter from New Jersey, is supervising the construction of a wood mill for John Sutter. Marshall was not fortunate in life. Born on October 8, 1810, he left his hometown in 1834 after his father's death, wandering through Indiana and Illinois before settling in Missouri. But malaria, a dangerous disease at the time, struck him. Following his doctor's advice, Marshall decided to head west in search of fresh air. In July 1845, after an arduous journey, he arrived at Sutter's Fort in California. Here, Marshall met John Augustus Sutter, a contradictory and complex figure in California history. Born on February 23, 1803, in Kandern, Baden, now part of Germany, near the Swiss border, Sutter was of Swiss-German descent. He served in the Swiss Army and worked in various professions. In 1826, at the age of 23, he married Anna Dubeld in Bergdorf, Switzerland, and had 4 children. However, successive business failures left Sutter heavily in debt. In May 1834, to escape his creditors, he left his wife and children behind and set off for America, promising to bring them back once he was settled. Sutter's journey to California was not easy. From New York, he traveled west to Missouri, then followed the Santa Fe Trail down to New Mexico. After that, he followed the Oregon Trail to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River. However, there were no direct ships to California, so in November 1838, Sutter had to travel by ship to the Sandwich Islands, now Hawaii, arriving in Honolulu in December 1838. There, he chartered the ship Clementine, taking 10 Hawaiian laborers with him to New Archangel, now Sitka, Alaska, a Russian colony, and finally to Yerba Buena, later San Francisco, on July 1st, 1839. At this time, California was still Mexican territory, with only about 1,000 scattered Europeans, while the native population was estimated at between 100,000 and 700,000. Sutter skillfully persuaded Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado to grant him nearly 50,000 acres, approximately 48,827 acres, in the Sacramento River area, on the condition that he become a Mexican citizen, which he fulfilled on August 29, 1840, and help prevent American encroachment. Ironically, however, Sutter welcomed and assisted the American settlers, a betrayal of his promise to the Mexican government. In August 1839, Sutter began construction of a walled settlement, naming it New Helvetia, New Switzerland, also known as Sutter's Fort. To enhance his social standing, he proclaimed himself Captain Sutter of the Swiss Guard, a completely fabricated title. But in this remote wilderness, no one could verify it. By 1843, the fort was complete, with 18-foot-high walls surrounding shops, houses, mills, and workshops. Situated on the Oregon-California Trail and near inland waterways from San Francisco, Sutter's Fort quickly became a major destination for most migrants to California. But behind the facade of a pioneer, Sutter concealed a disturbing dark side. He used indigenous labor as bedos, essentially slaves, to develop his agricultural empire. Historical records show that he treated the indigenous people cruelly, even using indigenous children as bargaining chips, giving them away to others. Governor Alvarado himself condemned Sutter's inhuman behavior in 1845, writing that the public can see how cruel Sutter was in not hesitating to take children from their Native American mothers. By 1847, Sutter was one of the wealthiest men in California, owning 13,000 head of cattle, a 10-acre orchard, and a thriving trading post. He had enough money and influence to carry out his plans to expand his empire, and it was this ambition that led him to a fateful decision: to build a wood mill on the American River, about 45 miles northeast of the fort. To carry out this project, Sutter hired James Marshall, whom he knew to be a skilled and reliable carpenter. In the summer of 1847, Marshall and a group of workers, many of whom were veterans of the Mormon Battalion, began constructing the sawmill at a site Marshall had chosen in Coloma. Construction progressed smoothly until January 1848, when they discovered the mill's tail race was too narrow and shallow to adequately water the mill wheels. Marshall decided to use the natural power of the river to deepen and widen the drainage ditch. This work could only be done at night, when the water flowed strongly and did not pose a danger to workers during the day. Every morning, Marshall checked the results of the previous night's work. And then, that fateful morning arrived. On January 24, 1848, as Marshall was inspecting the ditch beneath the mill, his eyes caught sight of something glittering in the riverbed. As he later recounted, "I picked up a piece or two and examined it carefully. With my limited knowledge of minerals, I could only think of two things that might have looked like this iron, very bright and brittle, or gold, bright but malleable." Marshall collected several samples and brought them back for the workers to see. One of them, Henry Bigler, a former Mormon soldier, immediately recorded in his diary, "Monday, the 24th. Today, a metal resembling gold was found in the drainage ditch, first discovered by James Marshall, the sawmill supervisor." Azariah Smith, another Mormon worker, also recorded the event. To verify, the workers performed simple tests they knew how to do, boiling the metal in an alkaline soap solution and hammering it to test its ductility. The metal retained its color and could be bent, a clear sign of gold. But Marshall was still not entirely sure. 4 days later, on January 28th, he rode back to Sutter's Fort, carrying those gleaming pieces of metal. What neither Marshall nor the workers knew was that while they were finding gold in California, a momentous historical event was taking place thousands of miles away. On February 2nd, 1848, just 9 days after Marshall discovered the gold, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in Mexico City, officially ending the Mexican-American War and transferring control of California to the United States. Neither side knew that the gold had just been discovered on land that was changing hands. When Marshall arrived at Sutter's fort, he met with Sutter privately and gave him the samples. Sutter, who possessed more extensive knowledge, conducted more detailed tests. He consulted his Encyclopedia Americana and performed further tests using nitric acid and specific gravity. The results were undeniable. It was gold, and gold of the highest quality. At least 23 carats, 96% purity, as Sutter later declared. But instead of rejoicing, Sutter felt a deep anxiety. He understood that if the news spread, everyone would abandon their work to go in search of gold. The sawmill would never be finished. The agricultural empire he had painstakingly built over nearly a decade would collapse. Sutter immediately summoned everyone at the sawmill and at the fort, demanding they swear to keep it a secret for at least 6 weeks, enough time for him to complete the sawmill and harvest the crops. But some secrets are too big to keep. News began to spread, at first whispers, vague stories. In February 1848, Sutter sent Charles Bennett to Monterey to meet with Colonel Richard Barnes Mason, the highest-ranking American military commander in California, to secure mining rights to the land where the sawmill stood. Sutter had warned Bennett absolutely not to reveal anything about the gold. But when Bennett stopped in Benicia and overheard people talking about the discovery of coal near Mount Diablo, he couldn't restrain himself and blurted out the discovery of gold. From there, the news spread like wildfire. On March 15, 1848, the Californian newspaper in San Francisco published a report about the discovery of gold, although many remained skeptical. California had experienced gold rumors before, and they had all been false. But this time was different. A few curious individuals quietly left San Francisco to investigate. When they returned with bags of gold dust, skepticism began to give way to belief. And it is at this point that a pivotal character enters the story. Samuel Brannan, the man who will turn the rumor into a global sensation, not for any noble purpose, but for a brilliant and calculated business plan. Samuel S. Brannan was born on March 2, 1819, in Saco, Massachusetts, now Maine, into a struggling family. To escape his abusive father at age 14, Brannan moved with his sister Mary Ann and brother-in-law Alexander to Painesville, Ohio. There, he became an apprentice at a printing press, a profession that would shape his future. In 1842, while working as a traveling printer across America, Brannan met and joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormon. With his excellent oratorical skills and organizational abilities, he quickly rose to the rank of elder in the church and was tasked with publishing the New York Messenger for the Mormon community. In 1846, when Mormons were being persecuted in the American East, Brannan, then 27 years old, organized a daring migration. He chartered the ship Brooklyn for $1,200 a month and led 238 Mormons, 70 men, 68 women, and 100 children, across the ocean to California. On board, he brought a printing press, a tool that would help him change history. After a long 24,000-mile journey around Cape Horn in South America, the Brooklyn docked at Yerba Buena, San Francisco, on July 31, 1846. Here, Brannan used his printing press to establish the California Star, the first newspaper in San Francisco, and the second in California after the Californian in Monterey. The first issue was published on January 9, 1847. With this media tool in hand, Brannan began to build his influence and fortune. In June 1847, Brannan walked hundreds of miles east to meet Brigham Young, the top leader of the Mormon Church, at Green River, Wyoming. He tried to persuade Young to lead the Mormon group to California as originally planned, but Young refused, deciding instead to settle in the Great Basin, now Utah. Brannan returned to California disappointed, but this turned out to be fortunate for his personal ambitions. Recognizing business opportunities in California, Brannan didn't rely solely on newspaper publishing. In the fall of 1847, he opened a general store at Sutter's Fort, a key stop on the Oregon-California Trail. This location gave him direct access to migrants and traders passing through. When news of the gold hoard began to spread in early 1848, many thought it was just another baseless rumor. Even Brannan's own California Star newspaper couldn't publish the news because all its staff had abandoned their jobs to search for gold. But Brannan, with his keen business acumen, saw a far greater opportunity than simply digging for gold. In late February or early March 1848, while everyone was still skeptical, Brannan quietly implemented a brilliant plan. He traveled throughout San Francisco and surrounding towns, buying up every mining tool he could find: shovels, spades, gold pans, hammers, crowbars, barrels, sacks, knives, gunpowder, blankets, flour, salt, and everything a gold miner might need. He stockpiled these goods at his shop in Sutter's Fort, simultaneously raising the prices many times over. A gold pan bought for 20 cents, Brannan resold for $15, a 75-fold profit. When he was ready, one day in May 1848, Brannan performed the most famous act in California history. He took a quinine vial full of gold dust, ran through Portsmouth Square in San Francisco, waving the vial in the air and shouting, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" Imagine this scene. A tiny town with fewer than 1,000 inhabitants, nestled on the shores of San Francisco Bay, suddenly erupts. Within days, nearly half the male population has abandoned everything: shops, homes, jobs, to rush off in search of gold. Sailors leave their ships. Craftsmen abandon their workshops. Even soldiers desert. The California Star had to cease publication because no one remained to work there. Another newspaper described San Francisco as a ghost town: shops closed, houses empty, boats abandoned. But this very ghost town would soon transform into one of the most vibrant cities on the planet. While everyone else was scrambling for gold, Brannan sat quietly in his shop at Sutter's Fort, counting his money. In May, June, and early July of 1848, his sales reached $36,000, a huge sum at the time. By 1849, his shop at Sutter's Fort was selling $150,000 worth of gold each month. This was clear evidence of the famous adage, in a gold rush, don't dig for gold, sell it. But the story of the gold rush didn't end in San Francisco. News spread throughout California at an unprecedented speed. Cities like Monterey, San Jose, Santa Barbara, all lost large numbers of their male populations. Farms were abandoned, livestock roamed without care, and crops rotted in the fields. For John Sutter, the nightmare he feared had come true. Workers quit en masse. The sawmill in Coloma, where the gold was discovered, was never completed. Gold prospectors swarmed his land, occupying it illegally, slaughtering his livestock for meat, and destroying his crops. Sutter tried to appeal to the authorities for intervention, but California was in a state of legal chaos. No longer Mexican territory, but not yet officially a U.S. state, California was in a power vacuum. No clear legal system, no effective courts, and no sufficiently strong law enforcement force. During this turbulent period, a key figure intervened: Colonel Richard Barnes Mason, the military governor of California. In late June 1848, at the urging of a talented young officer named William Tecumseh Sherman, who would later become a renowned general in the American Civil War, Mason decided to personally visit the gold mines to verify the rumors. What Mason witnessed stunned him. He wrote in his report, "2 miners on Weber Stream extracted $17,000 worth of gold in 7 days. 6 miners and 50 Native Americans extracted 273 pounds of gold." These were unbelievable figures. An average worker at that time would only earn a few $100s a year. Mason sent this report along with a tin of gold to Washington, D.C. The journey took months. The ship had to sail south around Cape Horn in South America, or cross the Isthmus of Panama and wait for another ship in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, news of the gold had begun to spread to neighboring countries. The Hawaiians, only 3 months by sea from California, were among the first outsiders to hear the news. Thousands of Hawaiians, who were accustomed to migrating to work on ships and farms, set out for California starting in the summer of 1848. Mexicans to the south, Chileans and Peruvians to South America, and especially the Chinese, all began their journey to Gamsan, Golden Mountain, as they called California. But on the east coast of the United States, more than 3,000 miles from California and separated by treacherous mountain ranges and deserts, skepticism remained. Major newspapers like the New York Herald reported the gold discovery as early as August 1848, but most readers believed it was just a hoax to deceive immigrants. There had been too many such stories in the past. Until December 5th, 1848. In his annual State of the Union address, President James K. Polk officially confirmed to Congress, "Reports of the abundance of gold deposits in California appear to be substantiated by credible fact." Along with the address, Polk displayed a tin box containing 230 ounces, over 6.5 kilograms of gold that Colonel Mason had sent. Polk himself, even with only a few months left in his term, could not hide the excitement in his voice. The president's confirmation was the final spark. From the next day, the entire east coast of the United States plunged into a full-blown gold rush. Newspapers printed countless articles about California with sensational headlines. Publishers quickly printed guidebooks on how to get to California and how to dig for gold, mostly written by people who had never set foot in California. Merchants began selling gold-digging equipment, maps, often inaccurate, and anything else they thought gold prospectors might need. And then, 1849 arrived, the year that defined the gold rush and gave birth to the term 49ers, which would resonate throughout history. What happened that year was truly a massive migration unprecedented in human history up to that point. An estimated 90,000 people arrived in California in 1849, about half by land and half by sea. Of these, approximately 50,000 to 60,000 were Americans, with the remainder coming from other countries around the world. But these aren't just dry statistics. Behind each number lies a personal story, dreams, hopes, and often tragedy. To understand the true scale of this gold rush, we need to look at the journeys people undertook to reach California, journeys that cost many their lives. There are 3 main routes to California, and each has its own challenges and dangers. The Transcontinental Highway is the route chosen by approximately 40,000 to 45,000 people in 1849. The journey, about 3,000 miles, nearly 5,000 kilometers, typically begins in Independence or St. Joseph, Missouri, follows the California Trail or Oregon Trail, crosses present-day Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, and finally traverses the Sierra Nevada mountain range to reach California. The trip usually takes 4 to 7 months, depending on weather and road conditions. The common image in the public imagination of horse-drawn carriages being attacked by Native Americans turned out not to be the greatest danger. In reality, attacks by Native Americans were rare. The real killer on this route was cholera, a terrifying disease caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholera. Cholera spread extremely quickly on crowded trains where water sources were often contaminated. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by the same afternoon. It is estimated that 1 in 12 people traveling by road to California died en route, a mortality rate of nearly 10%. Besides disease, migrants also faced scorching desert heat, terrible cold in the mountains, lack of water and food, accidents with horse-drawn carriages, and internal conflicts within the group. Many families were torn apart along the way. Women frequently became widows when their husbands died of illness or accident, and they had to continue the journey alone with their children. The Cape Horn sea route was chosen by about 20,000 people in 1849. This journey, approximately 18,000 nautical miles, about 33,000 kilometers, departed from East Coast ports such as New York or Boston, traveled south along the Atlantic coast of South America, circled Cape Horn, one of the world's most dangerous seas at the southern tip of Chile, and then returned north along the Pacific coast to San Francisco. The voyage typically took 5 to 8 months, depending on weather and the type of ship. Cruising around Cape Horn is a terrifying experience. The area is notorious for violent storms, with waves reaching 30 to 40 feet, winds that can reach 100 miles per hour, and freezing temperatures. Many ships have sunk here. Even if lucky enough to survive, passengers endure overcrowding. Often 200 to 400 people crammed into space meant for only 50 to 100. Poor sanitation, substandard food, and contaminated drinking water lead to widespread disease. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, is extremely common, resulting in tooth loss, skin hemorrhages, and general weakness. The route across the Isthmus of Panama was the shortest and fastest, but equally dangerous. Approximately 25,000 people chose this route in 1849. The journey began by steamship from the East Coast to the Caribbean coast of Panama, usually Chagres. Then involved traveling by canoe and riding mules or horses through 50 miles of treacherous rainforest to reach the Pacific coast, Panama City, from where they would wait for another ship to San Francisco. The crossing of the Isthmus of Panama usually takes only 4 to 7 days, but it is the most dangerous part. The Panamanian rainforest is a haven for mosquitoes carrying yellow fever and malaria, two diseases that killed thousands of people. Cholera was also very common. The hot, humid, and constantly damp temperatures, along with poor sanitation, allowed diseases to spread rapidly. Furthermore, upon reaching Panama City, many people had to wait weeks or even months for a ship to San Francisco because the number of ships was insufficient to meet the enormous demand. During this waiting period, they lived in terrible conditions and continued to face disease. It is estimated that 1,500 to 2,000 people died on the Panama Canal in 1849 alone. But despite these deadly dangers, people continued to flock to California. The reason was simple. Stories of gold had become legendary. People heard of early miners, the 48ers, making thousands of dollars in just weeks. A typical worker on the East Coast earned about $1 a day, but in California, even an average gold miner could find $10 to $15 worth of gold a day, equivalent to 6 years' wages in just 6 months. And these weren't just baseless stories. Henry Bigler, the Mormon worker who witnessed Marshall's gold discovery, recorded in his diary that he found $60 worth of gold in a single day. 2 miners on Weber Stream earned $17,000 in 7 days, an unimaginable sum at the time. These stories, though somewhat exaggerated through word of mouth, were enough to ignite the ambition in hundreds of thousands of people. But there was a group of people whose journey to California was far more complicated and dangerous, those who were not free to choose. We're talking about black people, both enslaved and free, who participated in the gold rush. Some free black people went voluntarily, hoping to find opportunity in a new land. But many others were enslaved people brought to California by their masters, forced to work in the gold mines without pay. California joined the Union in 1850 as a free state, prohibiting slavery. But in reality, the situation was far more complex. Many slave owners had brought their slaves to California before 1850 and later found ways to circumvent the law to keep them enslaved. Some forced slaves to sign long-term, voluntary labor contracts, essentially remaining slaves but legally. Freed black people also lacked full citizenship rights and were often mistreated by white gold miners. And then there were the Chinese, a key migrant group in the story of the gold rush. In 1849, only a few hundred Chinese arrived at Gamsan, Gold Mountain. But by 1852, that number had skyrocketed to over 20,000 in a single year. Most came from Canton province, which was suffering from poverty, war, and political instability following the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. The Chinese faced brutal discrimination from the moment they arrived in California. Their distinctive attire, long robes, baggy pants, and long braided hair made them easily identifiable and targets of violence. White miners, when they didn't find as much gold as expected, blamed the foreigners for stealing their gold. They attacked the Chinese, destroyed their camps, and drove them out of gold-rich areas. The California government legalized this discrimination through legislation. In 1850, California passed the Foreign Miners Tax, initially applied to all non-U.S. citizen miners at a rate of $20 per month, a huge sum at the time. The primary goal was to drive Chinese, Mexican, and South Americans out of the gold mines. This law was amended several times, but always targeted the Chinese. In 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law prohibiting Chinese immigration, a clear example of systemic racial discrimination. Mexicans and people from South American countries like Chile and Peru also faced similar violence and discrimination. Many of them had actually lived in California before gold was discovered. They were Mexican citizens when California was part of Mexico. But after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they suddenly became foreigners on their ancestral land. Chileans, in particular, were often collectively referred to as Chileans, regardless of their actual nationality, and they faced organized attacks, culminating in the events known as the Chile War of 1849, a series of violent clashes between Hispanic and Anglo-American miners. But of all the groups harmed by the gold rush, none suffered more than the indigenous peoples of California. This is one of the darkest chapters in American history, a systematic genocide that many historians today call the California Genocide. When the gold rush began in 1848, the native Californian population was estimated at between 100,000 and 150,000, a significant decrease from the 300,000 to 700,000 before the arrival of the Europeans. By 1870, just 2 decades later, this population had dwindled to approximately 30,000. Some died from diseases brought by the Europeans, measles, smallpox, influenza, but the majority perished from direct violence and deliberate famine. In 1848, Native Americans made up about half of the gold miners in California. John Sutter, Marshall, and many others hired or forced Native Americans to work in the gold mines. But when white settlers arrived, attitudes changed drastically. The new gold miners saw the Native Americans as obstacles to be eliminated. They occupied the Native Americans' traditional hunting and gathering lands, destroyed their food sources, and forced them off their ancestral lands. In 1850, California passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, a rather ironic name as the law essentially legalized the enslavement of Native Americans. The act allowed for the arrest of Native Americans for wandering and forced labor. It also permitted white people to adopt Native American children, essentially legal kidnapping. Furthermore, the act denied Native Americans the right to testify in court, meaning they could not denounce crimes committed against them. But far worse were the organized attacks. White gold prospectors regularly raided Native American villages, killing men, women, the elderly, and children. In some California counties, local authorities even paid people to bring back the heads or scalps of Native Americans, turning murder into a lucrative profession. In 1851 to 1852, the state of California spent approximately $1.1 million funding militias that hunted down Native Americans. The stories of these massacres were horrific. In April 1849, a group of gold prospectors attacked a Maidu village in Clear Creek, killing at least 20 people. In May 1850, At Bridge Gulch, a militia attacked a Wintu camp, killing about 150 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly. These stories were repeated throughout Northern California in the 1850s. Many indigenous peoples were forced to relocate to reservations where living conditions were extremely poor. Lack of food, clean water, and disease caused thousands to die of starvation and illness. Some indigenous groups attempted to resist, such as during the Modoc War, 1872 to 1873, but with outdated weapons and limited numbers, they had no chance against the overwhelming gunfire and military might of the white forces. This brutality was witnessed by many contemporaries, but few spoke out against it. The prevailing view was that the indigenous people were an obstacle to progress and needed to make way for civilization. The manifest destiny ideology, the belief that white Americans had a divine mission to spread across the continent, rationalized these atrocities. The portrayal of the indigenous people as barbarians to be eliminated became the mainstream view. While these tragedies unfolded throughout California, life in the gold rushes, and especially in San Francisco, was undergoing a dramatic transformation. San Francisco, a tiny town with fewer than 1,000 inhabitants in early 1848, exploded into a sprawling metropolis of 25,000 by the end of 1849. Just 2 years later, in 1852, the population had exceeded 50,000. Imagine that scene. A city built at breakneck speed where houses, shops, and saloons sprang up overnight. Abandoned ships became hotels, shops, even prisons. By June 1849, 200 abandoned ships were anchored in San Francisco Bay because their crews had deserted in search of gold. By 1851, that number had risen to 465. Some ships were towed ashore and buried under new buildings. Even today, when excavating in downtown San Francisco, ancient shipwrecks are occasionally found. Prices in San Francisco in the gold rushes skyrocketed to unbelievable levels. An egg could sell for $1 to $3. A pound of apples could fetch $5. A glass of water could cost $1. A room in a simple hotel could cost $10 to $20 a night, while an average worker on the East Coast earned only $1 a day. Carpenters, iron workers, and tailors could earn $10 to $15 a day, 10 to 15 times the East Coast wage. It was in this environment of sky-high prices that savvy entrepreneurs found their fortune, and one of the most classic success stories belongs to a man named Levi Strauss, who never actually dug for gold but made his fortune from the gold rush, and his legacy lives on to this day. Levi Strauss was born on February 26, 1829, as Loeb Strauss in Butenheim, Bavaria, now Germany, into a Jewish family. His father, Hirsch Strauss, was a poor traveling salesman who died of tuberculosis in 1845 when Levi was only 16 years old. In 1847, Levi's mother, along with Levi and his two sisters, emigrated to New York to reunite with his two older brothers, Jonas and Louis, who had emigrated earlier and were running a textile and clothing business in New York. Levi began working for his brother's company, studying business and English. By early 1853, while news of the California gold rush was still high, Levi, then 24 years old, decided to go to San Francisco to open a west branch of the family business. He arrived in San Francisco in March 1853 and opened a store selling fabrics, clothing, and general merchandise. But Levi Strauss's famous jeans didn't actually appear until many years later. In 1872, Levi received a letter from Jacob Davis, a Latvian Jewish tailor living in Reno, Nevada. Davis had figured out a way to make jeans more durable by using metal rivets to reinforce stress points like pockets and buttons. He used denim fabric purchased from Levi Strauss & Company to make these jeans, and they became very popular with miners, lumberjacks, and laborers. But Davis didn't have enough money to patent the invention, so he proposed a partnership with Levi. Levi recognized the business opportunity and agreed. On May 20, 1873, they received U.S. patent number 139,121 for an improvement in the attachment of trouser pockets. This marked the official birth of the modern jean, an invention born from the gold rush, but one that would endure far longer than the gold rush itself. While Levi Strauss was building his business empire, another extraordinary black woman was also forging her own destiny in San Francisco. Mary Ellen Pleasant, whom many would later call the mother of California civil rights. Mary Ellen Pleasant was born around 1814. The exact date is unknown, possibly in Philadelphia or Georgia. Her origins and childhood remain shrouded in mystery, but historians believe she had a slave mother and a white father. She was freed at some point in her adolescence and learned business skills. She first married a man named Alexander Smith, who was connected to the anti-slavery movement. After Smith died in 1844, leaving her an estate, she married John James Pleasant in 1848. In 1849, she and her husband went to California, not to pan for gold, but to do business. In San Francisco, Mary Ellen Pleasant proved herself to be an outstanding businesswoman. She started with a catering business, then opened restaurants and other ventures. She knew how to capitalize on the information she overheard from wealthy clients, who often discussed business and investment while dining. She wisely invested in real estate and other businesses, becoming one of the wealthiest African-American women in America at the time, with an estimated net worth of $30 million in today's dollars. But Pleasant was more interested in accumulating wealth. She used her fortune and influence to support the anti-slavery movement and help free black people. She secretly funded John Brown, a prominent anti-slavery activist, before the 1859 Harper's Ferry raid. She also fought against racial segregation laws in California, particularly those prohibiting black people from testifying in court and riding the streetcar. In 1866, Pleasant sued the San Francisco Streetcar Company for refusing her boarding, and she won, one of the first successful civil rights lawsuits in California. Her story is proof that the gold rush created opportunities for some people of color, even though they still faced severe racial discrimination. But San Francisco in the 1850s wasn't just about success stories. It was also a city rife with violence, crime, and chaos. There was no adequate police force, no effective court system, and the law was virtually non-existent. In this environment, criminal gangs thrived. Major fires frequently ravaged San Francisco, a city built primarily of wood and canvas. There were at least 6 major fires between 1849 and 1851, each destroying thousands of buildings. Many suspect some of these fires were arson committed by gangs seeking to loot during the chaos. The most notorious criminal groups were the Hounds and later the Sydney Ducks, a gang composed mainly of criminals from Australia. The Hounds were originally a group of veterans from the Mexican-American War who called themselves regulators. They claimed to maintain order, but were in reality a gang of extortionists and robbers, particularly targeting Chileans and Mexicans. In July 1849, they attacked the Chilean neighborhood of San Francisco, burning tents, looting, and assaulting residents. This incident sparked a fierce backlash from the community. There is a cruel paradox in history. The men who directly discovered gold, James Marshall and John Sutter, were the ones who lost the most from their discovery. This is not just a personal tragedy, but a profound lesson about the nature of the gold rush and the cruelty of history. Let's begin with John Sutter, the man on whose land gold was discovered. As mentioned in the previous section, Sutter painstakingly built the Nueva Helvetia empire over nearly a decade. By 1847, he was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in California. But within just a few years of the gold discovery, it all collapsed. The nightmare began as soon as news of the gold spread in the spring of 1848. Sutter's workers, from those at the sawmill and on the farms to the craftsmen at the fort, all abandoned their jobs to search for gold. Without workers, The sawmill at Coloma was never completed. The fields were abandoned. Crops rotted in the fields, left unharvested. Livestock roamed aimlessly. But far worse was the influx of gold prospectors. Thousands, then tens of thousands, poured into Sutter's land without permission, without paying. They pitched tents, dug the earth, and occupied it illegally. They killed Sutter's livestock for meat. They cut down his trees to build houses. They destroyed the irrigation system he had spent years building. And when Sutter tried to stop them, they threatened to kill him. Sutter attempted to use the law to protect his property, but this is where the real tragedy began. Sutter's land ownership rights were granted by the Mexican government under the Rancho Land System. After California became part of the United States under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, these land ownership rights had to be reestablished by the U.S. courts. The U.S. Congress passed the California Land Act of 1851, requiring all landowners under Mexican degrees to prove their ownership before a federal land commission. In theory, this was a fair process, but in practice, it became a legal nightmare that dragged on for years and cost enormous sums of money. Sutter hired lawyers and began a protracted legal battle. He had to provide proof of his land titles, but many documents had been lost or destroyed in the chaos of the gold rush. Lawyers charged exorbitant fees. The trials dragged on for years. And while Sutter was fighting in court, the land grabbers, squatters, continued to live on his land, mining for gold and getting rich. In 1850, to avoid losing everything, Sutter transferred most of his remaining assets to his eldest son, John Augustus Sutter, Jr., who had come to California from Switzerland in 1848 to help his father. This was a painful but necessary decision. Sutter, Jr., a more pragmatic businessman than his father, saw an opportunity in the chaos. He planned to build a new city on a portion of the family land, taking advantage of its strategic location near the gold mines and the Sacramento River. But this created a deep rift between father and son. Sutter, Jr. wanted to name the new city Sacramento, after the river. Meanwhile, Sutter, Sr. wanted the city named Sutterville and built near his fort at a location of his choosing. Ultimately, Sutter, Jr. won. The city of Sacramento was founded in February 1849, and it grew rapidly, becoming an important commercial center serving the gold mines. Sutter, Sr. felt betrayed. He believed his son had taken advantage of him and stolen his dream. The father-son relationship became strained. While Sutter, Jr. became successful and wealthy from developing Sacramento, Sutter, Sr. fell deeper into poverty and bitterness. The litigation dragged on. In 1855, the U.S. Land Commission finally confirmed Sutter's ownership of most of his land. This should have been a great victory, but in reality, it was only the first step. The land grabbers appealed the decision. The lawsuits continued for many more years, with ever-increasing legal costs. By 1858, after years of litigation, the court finally ruled in favor of the land grabbers in many cases, declaring that Sutter's land grants were invalid or unclear. This was a devastating blow. Sutter lost much of his land on which he had spent nearly 2 decades building. During this time, Sutter and his family retreated to Hawk Farm, a ranch on the Feather River, about 60 miles north of Sacramento. This was the last remaining site of the Nueva Helvetia Empire. There, Sutter attempted to live a quiet life with his wife Annette, who had come to California with their children in 1850 after a 16-year separation, and their remaining children. But fate had not yet released him. On the night of June 21, 1865, a mysterious fire completely destroyed Hawk Farm. The house, all the possessions, the memories, everything turned to ashes. Many believed it was a deliberate arson, an act of revenge by those who still hated Sutter because of the land disputes or because of his past treatment of the indigenous people. Sutter, now 62 years old, lost everything again. In 1864, the California legislature awarded Sutter a $250 monthly pension in recognition of his role in California history. But this was barely enough to live on. In 1871, Sutter moved to Lititz, Pennsylvania, a small town with a German and Swiss community where he hoped to find some peace in his later years. His wife, Annette, accompanied him. But Sutter couldn't give up. He still believed the American government owed him for all that was lost, for the empire he had built and which had been destroyed by the gold rush. From 1871 to 1880, Sutter spent the winter in Washington, D.C., relentlessly lobbying Congress, demanding compensation. He submitted dozens of petitions, met with countless congressmen, and recounted his story over and over again. On June 16, 1880, Congress once again adjourned without voting on a bill that would have awarded Sutter $50,000. A small sum compared to what he had lost, but at least recognition. Sutter, now 77, exhausted and desperate, had a mental breakdown. 2 days later, on June 18, 1880, John Augustus Sutter died at the Maids Hotel in Washington, D.C. He died alone, far from his homeland, far from California, where he had once ruled like a little king. His remains were returned to Lititz and buried next to the Moravian Cemetery. His wife, Annette Sutter, died the following January and was buried with him. Historian Josiah Royce, writing shortly after Sutter's death, succinctly summarized the character. In character, Sutter was a friendly and hospitable dreamer, with vague ideas, a keen desire for fame, and a compulsive tendency toward overdoing things. He was not a heroic figure, though his romanticized position as a pioneer in the Great Valley has led many travelers and historians to believe so. When the gold prospectors arrived, the paranoid Sutter completely lost all his truly great opportunities. Yet he also suffered much injustice from the newcomers. He died in poverty, bitterly complaining of the ingratitude of the Americans. But this assessment, while partly true, overlooks a crucial aspect. Sutter was not an innocent victim. As we saw in the previous section, he enslaved and treated the indigenous people cruelly. He abandoned his wife and children in Switzerland and only called them when he had achieved success. He cheated, was in debt, and always lived lavishly beyond his means. Sutter's tragedy is not the tragedy of a saint tormented by fate, but the tragedy of a man of grave flaws who built his empire on a precarious foundation of debt, exploitation, and luck. And when the gold rush came, everything collapsed. Now let's turn to James Wilson Marshall, the man who actually discovered gold. Marshall's fate was even more tragic than Sutter's, as he didn't even have the same glorious period that Sutter had. As mentioned, Marshall was born on October 8, 1810, in Hopewell Township, New Jersey, into a family with a patriotic tradition. His great-grandfather had signed the Declaration of Independence. But Marshall never achieved the greatness of his ancestors. He was just an ordinary carpenter, a man with crafting talent but lacking business skills and social skills. After discovering gold on January 24, 1848, Marshall expected recognition and reward. He believed that as the discoverer, he had special rights to the gold in the area. But he was completely mistaken. Under the law at the time, finding gold on public land did not confer any special ownership rights. Anyone could come and dig for gold on public land, according to the principle of first come, first served. Marshall attempted to claim ownership of several areas around Coloma where he believed there was gold, but when thousands of gold miners flocked in, they ignored Marshall's claims. They occupied the land Marshall thought was his, dug for gold, and made their fortune, while Marshall could only watch and seethe with anger. The sawmill that Marshall had worked so hard to build, the sawmill where he discovered gold, never became operational. All the workers left to search for gold. No one cared about lumber when there was gold to be found. Eventually, the sawmill was dismantled by the gold miners, who used the wood to build houses and continued digging underneath in search of gold. Marshall left Coloma in 1849 in bitterness. He wandered through the gold mines, trying to find gold like everyone else, but he had no luck. Perhaps this is the cruelest paradox. The first to discover gold was unable to find much for himself. But worse still, Marshall developed a bizarre and paranoia-like reputation. He began to believe that everyone was conspiring against him. He believed he had a mystical ability to find gold, and many gold prospectors followed him around the mines, hoping that he would lead them to gold. But as Marshall repeatedly failed to find gold, his followers gradually abandoned him. In 1857, after many years of wandering, Marshall returned to Coloma. He had successfully started a vineyard in the 1860s, growing grapes for winemaking. But this business also failed after a few years due to higher taxes, increased competition, and perhaps most importantly, Marshall's poor management skills. Marshall became increasingly bitter and isolated. He believed the world, or at least the state of California, owed him something for his great discovery. He wrote numerous letters of complaint, demanding compensation. Each financial setback he suffered he interpreted as a deliberate attempt by someone to strip him of what he considered his sacred right. In 1872, when Marshall was 62 years old, the California state legislature awarded him a $200 monthly pension in recognition of his contributions to California's thriving frog gold industry. This was a relatively generous sum at the time, enough for Marshall to live comfortably. He used part of the money to open a small blacksmith shop in Kelsey, a small town a few miles east of Coloma, but the joy was short-lived. In 1878, the state legislature did not renew Marshall's grant. The exact reason is unclear, but it was likely due to political change and the gradual forgetting of Marshall. For Marshall, this was another painful blow, further proof of his belief that the world had betrayed him. Marshall continued to live in Kelsey in a simple pioneer's log cabin, eking out a living from a small garden until his death on August 10, 1885. He died at the age of 74, in poverty and little known. His estate at the time of his death was just enough to cover the funeral expenses. At his last request, Marshall's body was frozen for transport to Coloma, where it was placed at Sierra Nevada House for the funeral, after which the coffin was carried up the hill to his grave, a hill overlooking the American River Valley where he had discovered gold 37 years earlier. Just days after his death, members of Placerville Parlor No. 9 of the Native Sons of the Golden West began planning a monument to Marshall. They lobbied the California state legislature for funding. In 1890, the legislature allocated $5,000 for the monument and an additional $4,000 for site improvements. On May 3, 1890, after a solemn ceremony, the giant American flag draped over the monument was pulled back, revealing a 9.5-foot-tall bronze statue of James W. Marshall. The monument has a 31-foot-high granite base, topped by a 9-foot 6-inch statue of Marshall dressed in miner's clothing. His right hand holds a gold nugget. His left hand points toward the original gold discovery site. The paradox of fate. While alive, Marshall was almost forgotten and died in poverty. But after his death, he was celebrated as a hero, a history changer. The question is, why didn't society acknowledge him while he was alive, when he was still in need of help? While Sutter and Marshall were consumed by tragedy, there was another man, Samuel Brannan, who had made a fortune from the gold rush, but ultimately lost it all, albeit for entirely different reasons. If John Sutter and James Marshall were victims of the gold rush, Samuel Brannan was an initial winner but ultimately a victim of his own ambition and extravagant lifestyle. Brannan's story is a cautionary tale about how getting rich quickly can also lead to an even quicker downfall. As mentioned in Part 2, Brannan became California's first millionaire thanks to a clever business strategy. Instead of digging for gold, he sold tools to gold miners. By the mid-1850s, Brannan was the richest man in California, with an estimated fortune of several $1,000,000, a colossal fortune at the time. Brannan owned many of San Francisco's most beautiful buildings, stores in numerous locations, and vast tracts of land in Sacramento and other areas. He established trade routes with China, Hawaii, and the east coast of the United States. He bought land in Honolulu. Brannan seemed to possess Midas powers. Everything he touched turned to gold. But behind that dazzling success was a man with serious flaws. Brannan made his money with reckless passion and energy, as one contemporary observer described him. But his destructive impulses, such as drinking, promiscuous love affairs, and fighting, also erupted. Brannan also had troubles with the Mormon Church. As mentioned, he was an elder of the California Mormon community and collected tithing from members. Several accounts state that Brigham Young sent the apostle Amasa Lyman to collect $10,000 in tithing that Brannan had withheld. When Young asked Brannan to return the tithing to Utah, Brannan reportedly responded defiantly, "I will give the money to the Lord when I receive a receipt signed by the Lord." This behavior, along with his involvement in the violent activities of the Vigilance Committee, led to Brannan's expulsion from the church on September 1, 1851, for unchristian conduct and neglect of duty. But Brannan didn't care. He had abandoned Mormonism to focus on accumulating wealth, and for a time, things seemed to be going well. In 1853, Brannan invested in the development of the Calistoga Resort in Napa Valley, creating one of the first hot spring resorts in California. He also invested in land in Mexico, Hawaii, and elsewhere. He lived lavishly, throwing extravagant parties, buying the finest buildings, and traveling luxuriously. But it was this extravagant lifestyle that ultimately led to his downfall. Brannan married Anne Eliza Corwin in 1840 before he moved to California. She accompanied him on the Brooklyn in 1846 and bore him 3 children. But as Brannan became wealthy, he began to have frequent affairs and become drunk. The marriage deteriorated. In 1870, Anne Eliza filed for divorce, a bold decision for a woman at that time. The divorce became one of the most contentious divorces in California history. Anne Eliza demanded half of Brannan's assets, a colossal sum. Brannan fiercely resisted, but ultimately, in 1870, the court ruled in favor of Anne Eliza. She was awarded a large portion of Brannan's assets, worth approximately $500,000, one of the largest divorce settlements of the time. This painful blow was just the beginning of Brannan's downfall. Throughout the 1870s, he continued his reckless investments in Mexican projects, particularly in the development of the Sonora colony. He invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in land acquisition and infrastructure development, hoping to replicate his California success. But the project failed completely. The Mexican government did not support him as he had hoped, and the settlers did not arrive as expected. Brannan was also embroiled in other costly legal battles, including land disputes and debts. His poor investments, coupled with a lavish lifestyle and enormous legal expenses, depleted his fortune. By the late 1870s, Brannan, who had once been California's first millionaire, was nearly bankrupt. In 1880, in a state of financial desperation, Brannan attempted to restart his career in Southern California, but failed. He moved to Guaymas, Mexico, where he lived in poverty, relying on the help of others. His health deteriorated rapidly due to years of heavy drinking. On May 14, 1889, Samuel Brannan, the man who had once shouted, "Gold!" and changed California history, died in a modest vacation home in Escondido, California, at the age of 70. He died in poverty, forgotten by most. His estate at the time of his death was barely enough to cover the funeral expenses. A man who once owned a quarter of San Francisco now had nothing left but debt and memories of lost glory. Brannan's story is a cautionary tale. Wealth acquired quickly can be lost even faster if not managed wisely. But he also left a legacy. Modern San Francisco and California are partly built on the foundations Brannan laid. While these individual figures experienced their own tragedies, California as a whole was undergoing a historic transformation. The gold rush had turned California from a remote wasteland into one of America's most important places at an unprecedented pace. California's population exploded dramatically. In 1848, before the discovery of gold, California had approximately 14,000 non-natives, mostly Hispanics and Mexicans, and about 150,000 natives. By 1850, just 2 years later, the non-native population had risen to approximately 92,597. By 1852, this number had exceeded 220,000. This was an unprecedented rate of population growth in American history. This sudden population growth created immense political pressure for California to become a state. But the issue of slavery turned this process into a national political crisis. In 1850, the United States had 15 free states and 15 slave states, a delicate balance in Congress. California's entry as a free state would disrupt this balance and potentially trigger a serious constitutional crisis. However, California couldn't wait. With no formal civil government from the federal government, the people of California organized themselves. In September 1849, 48 delegates met at Colton Hall in Monterey to draft the state constitution. This constitutional convention was an extraordinary event, a diverse group of people from all over the world coming together to create a new government. Delegates included Americans from various states, both North and South, Hispanic Mexican, Californios, and even some Europeans. Among them were figures like Robert Semple, a 6-foot-8-inch printer from Kentucky who was elected president of the convention. William Gwynn, a former congressman from Mississippi who would become California's first senator. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, a wealthy and influential Mexican general who represented the Californio community, and many others. The debate at the Constitutional Convention focused on many issues, but the most important was slavery. Ultimately, on October 13, 1849, the Constitution was adopted with a clear provision prohibiting slavery in California. Article 1, Section 18 of the 1849 California Constitution states, "There shall be no slavery in California, nor shall there be any involuntary labor except as punishment for crimes." This decision wasn't due to California being particularly progressive on civil rights. In fact, as we've seen, California was very cruel to Native Americans, free black people, Chinese, and other minority groups. The primary reason for banning slavery was economic. White gold miners didn't want to compete with slave labor. They believed that if slavery was allowed, wealthy slave owners from the South would bring hundreds of slaves to California, seize the best gold mines, and individual miners would have no chance. The Constitution was overwhelmingly ratified by the people of California on November 13, 1849. On that same day, Peter Hardeman Burnett, a lawyer from Oregon, was elected the first governor of California, although California was not yet officially a state. Burnett took office on December 20, 1849, and the California State Legislature held its first meeting on December 15, 1849, in San Jose. But in Washington, D.C., the debate over California's accession to the Union had become a serious political crisis. Southern senators and representatives threatened to secede from the Union if California were allowed to join as a free state. They argued that this violated the rights of enslaved states to equal territorial enjoyment of the Union. The debate lasted for the first 8 months of 1850, filled with heated rhetoric and threats of violence. President Zachary Taylor, despite being a slave owner himself, supported California's accession as a free state. But Taylor died suddenly on July 9, 1850, possibly from cholera or food poisoning. And Vice President Millard Fillmore became president. The Senate passed the California Bill on August 13, 1850, by a vote of 34 to 18. The House of Representatives passed it on September 7, 1850, by a vote of 150 to 56. President Fillmore signed the bill into law on September 9, 1850, and California officially became the 31st state of the United States. News reached San Francisco in October 1850, and the city erupted in celebration. On October 29, 1850, a grand parade was held through Portsmouth Square with thousands of participants. Fireworks were fired, flags were flown everywhere, and Californians celebrated their final, legitimate, and recognized government. But the Compromise of 1850, while addressing the immediate crisis, was only a temporary solution. The fundamental issues of slavery remained unresolved, and they would continue to cause tension for the next decade, ultimately leading to the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of the compromise, caused outrage in the northern states and actually increased tensions rather than reduced them. For California, becoming a state brought much-needed political stability, but it didn't solve many serious social problems. Racism, violence, corruption, and chaos continued for years afterward. One of the biggest problems is the environmental impact. Hydraulic gold mining, a method used by large companies since the mid-1850s, has caused enormous environmental damage. This method uses high-pressure water jets, which can generate enough force to kill a person, to break up hills and cliffs, washing away soil and rock in search of gold. Millions of tons of sediment were washed into rivers and streams. The Sacramento River and other rivers became shallow and full of mud. The riverbeds rose, causing severe flooding in the valleys below. Farmers in the Sacramento Valley complained that their fields were buried under mud from the gold mines. Salmon and other fish, an important food source for the indigenous people, were killed off in droves due to polluted water and blocked migration routes. In 1884, after years of litigation, a California court banned hydraulic fracturing, MCR, in the case of Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Mining and Gravel Company. This was one of the first major environmental decisions in American history, recognizing that an industry cannot harm others and the environment without consequences. But the damage was done. An estimated 1.5 billion cubic meters of sediment were eroded by hydraulic fracturing, enough to fill a canyon 100 feet deep, 1 mile wide, and 30 miles long. Some areas in California have not fully recovered to this day. And then there's the question, how much gold was actually found? According to the United States Geological Survey, a total of approximately 750,000 pounds, about 340 tons of gold, was mined during the California Gold Rush from 1848 to 1855. Its value at the time was about $10 million, equivalent to about $300 million today. But if calculated at current gold prices, around $2,000 per ounce, the value would be around $20 to $25 billion. But who benefited from all this gold? As we've seen, not the gold discoverers, not most of the gold miners. The vast majority of them had toiled for years and arrived in poorer Californias. Not the indigenous people. They were subjected to genocide. Not the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Chileans. They were discriminated against and exploited. The real millionaires were merchants like Sam Brannan, before he lost everything, Levi Strauss, and countless others who provided goods and services. Innkeepers, tavern owners, restaurant owners, ship owners, land speculators, banks, and moneylenders. The gold rush created a complete economy, and those who knew how to exploit that economy, not just mine for gold, were the real winners. Some of the largest banks in California, and later in America, were founded during the gold rush. Wells Fargo and Company was established in 1852 to serve gold miners. The Bank of California was founded in 1864. These institutions used the capital amassed from the gold rush to grow into financial empires. Railroads, particularly the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, were also partly financed by California gold. Four prominent railroad tycoons, Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, known as the Big Four, made their fortunes from building railroads to serve the gold mines and later expanding them into a national network. So what is the ultimate legacy of the California gold rush? In this next and final installment, we will explore how the gold rush shaped modern California, changed the nature of the American dream, and left behind lessons that remain relevant today. As we stand more than 170 years after James Marshall found the first piece of gold, the question arises: what legacy did the California gold rush truly leave for the world? The answer is far more complex than simply saying it made California a wealthy state. The gold rush reshaped America, and indeed the world, in profound and lasting ways that many people today fail to recognize. Let's begin with the global economic impact. The enormous amount of gold from California, estimated at around 750,000 pounds, 340 tons, from 1848 to 1855, worth $550 million at the time, equivalent to about 1.8% of the U.S. GDP in that decade, flooded into the global monetary system. This had far-reaching economic consequences. First, it reversed a decades-long deflationary trend. From the 1820s to the 1840s, the world experienced deflation because the supply of gold and silver increased more slowly than economic growth. But the California gold rush, along with the discovery of gold in Australia in 1851, reversed this. According to economic historians, the surge in gold production from California and Australia was linked to a 30% increase in wholesale prices from 1850 to 1855. This inflation wasn't necessarily negative. In fact, it stimulated investment and economic growth. California gold financed new infrastructure around the world. Farmers in Chile, Australia, and Hawaii found huge new markets for their food selling to California gold miners. British manufactured goods were in high demand. Clothing and even prefabricated houses came from China. The large amounts of California gold paid for these goods drove up prices and stimulated investment and job creation worldwide. California gold also helped establish the international gold standard in the late 19th century. With a greater abundance of gold, nations could rely on pegging their currencies to gold, creating a stable, though imperfect, international monetary system that would last until World War I. But perhaps the most significant economic impact of the gold rush was how it reshaped the economy of California and ultimately the entire American West. The gold rush created a much more complex and diversified economy than simply mining for gold. The gold wave led to the expansion of manufacturing and services, as many entrepreneurial newcomers capitalized on the demand for mined materials, lumber, clothing, and transportation. Agriculture and retail also grew exponentially. By the end of the 19th century, California had become an economic powerhouse. In fact, by the mid-1850s, the state's farms had made California self-sufficient in wheat cultivation. Cattle farming flourished. In the 1880s, a single farmer earned $800,000 from his wheat crop. And during that decade, the value of the state's agricultural output surpassed the value of its mines. The shift from gold mining to agriculture was no accident. It was a direct result of the ban on hydraulic fracturing. On January 7, 1884, State Court Judge Lorenzo Sawyer finally ruled in favor of the farmers in Woodruff versus North Bloomfield, bringing an official end to hydraulic fracturing. This was one of the first landmark environmental decisions in American history, but the environmental damage caused was enormous and long-lasting. From 1860 to 1880, California's mining operations yielded $170 million from hydraulic fracturing. But to obtain that money, they destroyed thousands of acres of land. Millions of tons of sediment washed into rivers, clogging waterways, causing floods and burying farmland under mud. Dozens of feet of sediment accumulate in river basins, destroying half the state's salmon habitat, and mud from mines buries farms and kills crops in the Central Valley. In San Francisco, smelters release carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, sulfur dioxide, methane, and lead into the air. Ecological diversity is severely damaged. Forests are destroyed for timber production. The soil is contaminated with chemicals from mining. Some areas have not fully recovered to this day. As you travel through certain regions of Northern California, you can still see eroded hills, dried-up rivers, and traces of hydraulic fracturing scars on the landscape that remain more than 140 years after the activity ceased. But perhaps the most complex legacy of the gold rush is its social and demographic impact. California has become one of the most multicultural places in the world, but this diversity has been accompanied by deep-seated racism, violence, and injustice. As we have seen, the gold rush had a devastating impact on Native Californians and accelerated the decline of the Native American population due to disease, starvation, and the California genocide. This is a crime that California must confront and acknowledge. In 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom officially apologized for the state's actions in the genocide of Native Americans. But no amount of compensation can make up for the lives lost and the culture destroyed. For the Chinese, Americans, unfairly arguing that these Chinese immigrants were taking away revenue and job opportunities from other Americans, pushed forward restrictions on Chinese immigration and created taxes on all foreign miners working in California. This led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first federal law prohibiting a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. This act remained in place until 1943 and set a precedent for other discriminatory immigration policies. But the Chinese survived and thrived despite the discrimination. Before the law was repealed, many Chinese left the mining camps, moving to San Francisco, where they soon established themselves in the city's business community and created America's first Chinatown. Today, San Francisco's Chinatown is one of the city's most popular tourist destinations and a symbol of the resilience and contributions of Asian Americans. The gold rush also created opportunities for women that they did not have on the East Coast. During the gold rush, approximately 40,000 people arrived in San Francisco Bay by ship in 1849, of whom only 700 were women, including the poor, the rich, business people, prostitutes, singles, and married women. They came from many different ethnic backgrounds. The scarcity of women certainly enhanced their commercial advantages and opportunities. Women could earn money in many ways, opening inns, restaurants, laundries, teaching, or businesses. Some, like Mary Ellen Pleasant, whom we met, became wealthy and influential entrepreneurs. And then there are the brands and businesses that the gold rush gave birth to, names that survive to this day. Wells Fargo and Company, founded by Henry Wells and William Fargo, saw an opportunity to provide financial services to gold prospectors. Levi Strauss, a German immigrant, identified the miners' need for durable clothing and created canvas trousers that could withstand the grueling hours of gold mining. Wells Fargo today is one of the world's largest banks with assets exceeding $1.9 trillion. Levi Strauss & Company is a global clothing company with billions of dollars in annual revenue. These companies, and many others founded during the gold rush, are testaments to the lasting economic legacy of this historical event. But perhaps the most important legacy of the gold rush is how it shaped Californian ideology and culture, and ultimately, the entire United States. The gold rush reinforced the idea of the American dream, the belief that anyone, regardless of background, could succeed through hard work and luck. This isn't entirely true, as we've seen. Most of the gold miners didn't get rich. Indigenous people, Black people, Chinese people, Latinos, all faced discrimination and were denied equal opportunities. But the myth persists. California is a place where anything is possible, where you can reinvent yourself, where the future matters more than the past. According to Rohrbaugh, one of the main contributors to the California gold rush was California's rapid Americanization. Before the gold rush, California was a frontier region with only tenuous ties to the rest of the United States. But the large number of Americans who settled in California maintained contact with their families on the East Coast and Midwest. They viewed the state as an extension of the United States. This has significant political implications. He argues that the gold rush was a key factor in California becoming a state in 1850, while the territories of New Mexico and Arizona, occupied at the same time, did not enjoy statehood until 1912. And the gold rush created a physical connection between East and West. The need to transport people and goods to California led to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869. This colossal project was partly financed by California gold and largely built by Chinese labor, a cruel paradox as these same workers were later excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act. Railroads transformed California and the entire West. A journey from New York to San Francisco, which once took 4 to 6 months by land or sea, now takes only 6 days. Costs plummeted. Goods could move freely. People could travel more easily. California was no longer a remote, isolated region. It had become an integral part of the United States. As we stand in the 21st century, looking back at the California gold rush, it's easy to view it as a distant historical event, irrelevant to our modern lives. But that would be a grave mistake. Because the gold rush not only shaped California and America in the past, it continues to shape us today. And the lessons from the gold rush remain extremely relevant. Let's begin with the striking parallel between the 1848 gold rush and our modern-day gold rush, Silicon Valley, and the technological revolution. The gold rush not only created the blueprint for later high-tech endeavors in California, it also spawned a technological stream that led directly to Silicon Valley. Old California's extractive industries, mining, agriculture, oil, laid the intellectual, institutional, financial, and technological foundations for new California's industries, aerospace, electronics, computing, and biotechnology. The resemblance is almost frightening. The common image of the gold rush is that of the bearded 49-year-old gold digger, armed only with a pickaxe and a frying pan. This romantic image of the individual entrepreneur venturing into a new frontier with considerable risk, finding gold through sheer willpower, perseverance, and ingenuity, resonates in California mythology today. According to data, California leads the major states, ahead of Texas and Florida, in the percentage of residents who start companies in any given month, according to the Kauffman Index, a long-standing measure of American entrepreneurship. California has the highest rate of startup and established company failures in the nation, exactly like during the gold rush. The appetite for risk-taking also fueled Silicon Valley's growth, turning Californians like Facebook co-founder Mark Zuckerberg, Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison, and Elon Musk, CEO of SpaceX and Tesla, into billionaires. And much like the gold rush, Silicon Valley has seen both great successes and great failures. Silicon Valley lost more than 85,000 high-tech jobs in the years following the bursting of the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. Even the problems are similar. Just as the gold rush led to skyrocketing prices in San Francisco, making life unaffordable for the average person, Silicon Valley today is also causing a housing crisis. The average home price in San Francisco and Silicon Valley now exceeds $1 million. Forcing many to leave. Although prices in California during the gold rush were actually much higher than they are today when adjusted for inflation. And just as the gold rush led to discrimination against Chinese and others, today's tech craze has led to new tensions. San Francisco natives complain that tech workers are occupying their city, driving up prices and changing the culture. There have been protests against Google buses. There are concerns about a lack of diversity in tech companies. Women and minorities remain severely underrepresented. But there's a crucial difference. While these stories represent the part people enjoy hearing, there's always the bad and the ugly that we don't fully understand. Environmental impact, conflicts between old and new Californians, and the unintended consequences of rapid change. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from the past. We can recognize these problems before they become insurmountable. As we conclude our exploration of the California gold rush, one final question remains. Was the gold rush worth it? Did the benefits, economic growth, California becoming a state, innovation and entrepreneurship override the costs? Indigenous genocide, environmental destruction, racial discrimination, and social injustice. This is not a question any historian can answer objectively. It is a moral question that each person must answer for themselves. But what we can say with certainty is, the California gold rush happened, and it changed the world forever. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. And perhaps the most important lesson, history isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future. The choices we make today about technology, about the environment, about social justice, about how we treat the marginalized, will be judged by future generations in the same way we judged the people who came to California in 1849. Will future generations look back on our era, the era of Silicon Valley, AI, and cryptocurrency, and see a story of progress and opportunity? Or will they see a story repeating the mistakes of the past, inequality, environmental destruction, and unfair treatment of the vulnerable? The answer lies in our hands. And that is why studying history, understanding what happened during the California gold rush, is not just intellectually fascinating. It is necessary. Because when we fail to learn from history, we are condemned to repeat it. And California, a state built on gold, dreams, and suffering, remains a powerful reminder of both humanity's highest potentials and lowest failures. Gold has made California rich, but it is the people, with all their complexity, contradictions, ambitions, and tragedies, who truly make California important in history. And their stories, the stories of James Marshall, John Sutter, Sam Brannan, Mary Ellen Pleasant, the unnamed Chinese, the forgotten indigenous people, the resilient women, the shrewd traders, and hundreds of thousands of others who came to California with hope, still resonate today. Because at its core, it's a story about humanity. Humanity at its best and worst. Humanity seeking opportunity. Humanity dreaming of a better future. Humanity willing to risk everything. But also, humanity that exploits, discriminates, and destroys. And that is our story. The story of America. The story of humanity. And so we have completed our journey through one of the most thrilling chapters in history, the California Gold Rush from 1848 to 1855. From the fateful morning of January 24, 1848, when James Marshall found the first gold nugget, to the collapse of private mining and the rise of industrial mining, we have witnessed an unprecedented transformation in human history. We've seen John Sutter, the landowner where the gold was discovered, lose everything and die bitterly. We've seen James Marshall, the actual discoverer of gold, die in poverty and only be honored posthumously. We've seen Sam Brannan, the first to shout "Gold!" and become a millionaire, ultimately lose everything because of his ambition and extravagant lifestyle. But we've also seen people like Levi Strauss, who never struck gold but built a clothing empire that survives to this day. Mary Ellen Pleasant, a woman of color who seized opportunities to become a millionaire and fight for justice. Resilient Chinese people who built communities despite brutal discrimination. We have seen the light and the darkness of human nature, dreams and ambitions, hope and despair, innovation and destruction, justice and injustice. California today, with 39 million people, the world's fifth largest economy, and a global technology hub, is a direct legacy of the gold rush. Without the gold rush of 1848, California might have remained a remote frontier for decades to come. Without the gold rush, there might not have been the transcontinental railroad. There would be no San Francisco as we know it. There would be no Silicon Valley. There would be no Hollywood. But there was also no genocide of native Californians, no Chinese Exclusion Act, no large-scale environmental destruction. History is always complex. It's never just black and white. So, as we conclude this story, I want to leave you with one final thought. History is not fate. We are not obligated to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to avoid repeating them, we must know them. That's why stories like the California Gold Rush are important, not just because they're thrilling and dramatic, though they certainly are, but because they teach us important lessons about people, about society, about the choices we make when faced with great opportunities and challenges. When you look at California today, the tech companies, the bustling cities, the prestigious universities, the busy highways, remember that it all began with a small piece of gold in the hands of a carpenter on a cold winter morning in 1848. And when you think about the future, about AI, about space exploration, about the new 21st century gold rushes, remember the lessons from the past. Ask, who benefits? Who pays the price? What will be the lasting legacy? And how can we ensure that this time we do better? That is our challenge. That is our responsibility. And that is our opportunity to write a better chapter of history, a chapter that future generations will look back on with pride, not with shame. Thank you for joining History PhD on our journey exploring the California Gold Rush. If you enjoyed this documentary series, please remember to subscribe, like, and share to support us in continuing to produce quality historical content. Leave a comment below to let us know what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. And remember, history is not just about the past. History is about us, about the choices we make, the legacy we leave behind, and the future we build. From the History PhD channel, I am your narrator. See you again in the next historical adventures. Goodbye. And I will always love history.